All right, after Paul has defended himself, now we begin to get into Acts 27 to 28 to show us the end of the story of Acts. And it is the telling of Paul getting from Jerusalem, or from Caesarea, I should say, to Rome. Now, I sort of laugh here because just like everything else Paul does, this can't be simple. You would think the easiest thing to be was they put him on a ship, he sailed to Rome, and he was at Rome. Instead, we get 2 chapters to talk about Paul's things. And I say that in laughing because if you know 2 Corinthians 12, Paul lists all the troubles he's had. You want to talk about somebody who had a lot of troubles everywhere they went, it was Paul. And what's interesting is Paul wrote 2 Corinthians, and he talks about being shipwrecked, 2 Corinthians 12. The interesting timing of that is that Paul wrote 2 Corinthians in the timeline before where we're at in Acts. He's already written 2 Corinthians. So the shipwreck we're about to hear about is Paul's at least second time being shipwrecked. And that may explain why when we see Paul and the Roman officer argue, that may be why Paul argues a little bit, is Paul's like, hey, look, I've been here before. I know what's going to happen if you don't stop. And so that may give us some credence into what Paul does here. And again, this is another part of Bible study that is so interesting, is when you line up timeline and try to figure out where these letters take place, because you see these kind of facts and you see this kind of thing happen. But so we begin in verse 1. Paul decides that, or Paul is there at Rome, or at Caesarea. The time is decided they're going to send Paul and his fellow prisoners to Rome. There's some other prisoners who need to go to Rome. And so they choose a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Now you'll notice, you remember Acts 10, Cornelius was a part of the Italian cohort, or he was the leader of the Italian cohort. Here we have the Augustan cohort. This would have been named for Augustus Caesar. And so you have this centurion. Now, you'll notice what they do here. They do something very interesting. They don't load Paul on a slave ship, or not a slave, a prison ship, a Roman warship, and send him to Rome. What they do is they use the ships that are there. They use ships that are in Caesarea that are traveling toward Rome. And as a matter of fact, we're going to see him swap ships, that they're going to take ships that are traveling the direction they want to go. And so what the Romans would do is they come into a port like Caesarea, they would talk to the people about where they're going, and they would find a ship that was sailing that direction, and they would get on that ship and they would head out toward their destination. And they would pay these ships to allow the prisoners, the soldiers, to travel on this ship. So this is what they're going to do. Now, what's interesting in verse 2 is notice they embarked for a ship in Adramyttium, which was about to sail for the ports of Asia. We put to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and to be cared for. So what we see is they begin to travel out, and as they travel, Julius treats Paul like everybody else has. Paul has been this prisoner, but yet he's been proven over and over again that he is a fair, unrightly imprisoned prisoner, and therefore they're going to not keep him and not are not going to treat him like a dangerous prisoner. I'll get the word right in a minute. And so they begin to sail out. Now you notice they travel and they go to these different ports. Now what we see in the last travel of Paul is, notice they leave Caesarea, they go to Sidon, then they're going to catch a boat to go over here to Myra, and then they're going to come around to Lycia. Lycia is going to be where they have their trouble. And you notice verse 4, they put out and they sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra and Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. So notice, one ship takes them from Caesarea all the way up to Myra. Then in Myra, they get on a ship headed to Italy. Now what happens is, you notice they go around Cyprus because the Mediterranean, in the winter months, you cannot travel. There are storms that pop up, the ships will be sunk, and that's why you're going to notice they'll talk about staying close to the island or to the land. They don't go across open island. They're only at this one point. They talks about open sea because they have to cut across to get to Myra. And they're already having sails against them. Notice they get on a ship to go to a ship of Alexandria. Now, Alexandria is down here. It's in northern Africa, Alexandria. So this is a ship from Alexandria that's in Myra that's headed to Italy. And so they swap ships. And they began to take off. Verse 7, notice they sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the winds did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off of Salmone, coasting along it with difficulty. We came to a place called Fair Havens, which is near the sea, or near which was the city of Lycia. So they come around here and they hit Fair Havens. Now, this is the interesting thing. You'll notice this red line of how far off they go. The question comes up in verse 9. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because of the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of cargo and the ship, but also our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put it out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So here's where they're at, and this is why I kept the map up. They are right here in Lycia. Paul says, let's harbor. Stay here for the winter. Lycia is not as good of a place of a harbor as Phoenix. Phoenix is not that far. It's sort of like that idea. They say, hey, look, it's just a couple more days. We can get there. There's no big deal. Well, let's just sail around Crete, and then we'll make it to Phoenix. And so this was the decision of where do we stop, Lycia or Phoenix? Paul says stay at Lycia. And notice it's very interesting that we see here that Paul is saying this of his own accord. Because notice what he says, if we leave if we leave Lycia, we're going to get there's going to be a great cost of the ship, the cargo, and people's lives. Later on, we're going to find out that Jesus is going to tell you nobody's going to die if you listen. If you do what I tell you, nobody's going to die. So Paul doesn't know that fact yet, but Paul knows this is where we're worried about. Now, they want to get a port. The reason they want a port facing southwest and northwest is they want a port where they can get out quicker. Lycia would have been a port you can stay in, but it took longer for it to calm down and thaw out than Phoenix would. And so that's why they're pushing for Phoenix. And so they began to go toward Phoenix. Notice verse 13. Now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. So they start around, they get a wind from the south, and they say, hey, this Paul didn't know what he's talking about. See, listen to us. We got the wind we want. But notice the very next verse. But soon a tempestuous wind came from the north, called a nor'easter, struck down from the land, and when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, they gave way to it and were driven along. So they're turning to go north. They're going northwest, but the wind comes from the land and pushes them. It pushes them away from the Crete into the sea. And as they began to go into the sea, this is where we begin to see the difficulty that happens. Not long after leaving Lycia, they make the storm that prevents them from going to harbor. You'll notice it says that they couldn't face the wind and we gave way to it. Meaning they were trying to fight the wind at first and they realized they couldn't fight it, so they just quit rowing. And they couldn't go in, so they had to depend upon their sails. When they depended upon their sails, they were subject to wherever the wind took them. And then notice they began to go from there. Again, we're not going to read all this. It tells us all they did to take this up. They tried to make land, or tried to avoid the land. It talks about them coming near to Caudia. This is this little island here. They almost run aground. They have to avoid that. And then you notice verse 18, the storm begins to go. So they went from just the wind to now the storm. And notice this, what happens here. They deal with the storm. And this is what I've often worried about, wondered about. And makes me glad I'm not in that position. It's bad enough to deal with the storm, but to be on a ship and deal with the storm. It is even worse to be on a ship dealing with a storm for days on end. Notice what he talks about. The storm comes in, verse 18. The violent ship, the storm tossed them, and they began the next day to jettison the cargo. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest laid upon us. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. So what you basically see, Luke tells us, is that Paul warned them, you leave the port, people are going to die, the ship's going to be lost. They doubt it. Now his prophecy is coming true. And I say prophecy in what he said would happen. It's not a biblical prophecy because he said they would die in the night. But notice it's gotten so bad that even the people lose hope. They lose all hope of being saved. And the idea is that everyone loses hope. Now, verse 21, after being without food for a long time, because again, they don't know how long they're going to be here, so they start rationing out food and they cut the food back. Paul stands up and Paul begins in a way that I don't know if I'd have began myself.
I told you so.
Yeah, I told you so. In the midst of a storm, in the midst of everything, he stands up. I told y'all you should have stayed back, but you just didn't listen to me. If he'd have stopped there, it probably would have been worse. They probably would have thrown him overboard. But notice what he says, verse 22. He says, now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and to whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I've been told. But we must run aground on some island. So Paul, in the midst of this storm, and it's very interesting, after the people give up hope of being saved, Paul stands up and says, I told you we shouldn't have done this. He said, but God has spoke to me. God has told me we're going to be saved. Now again, I think this happens at this point for a reason. If they're still thinking they can fight the storm, they're not going to put as much faith in what Paul has to say. But because they have no hope, no inkling of any hope of being saved, this is their only hope. And therefore they're going to listen to Paul. They're going to hear what he has to say. Now notice verse 27. Paul tells them what they got to do. And on the 14th night. Now imagine that for a minute. 3 days is bad enough. Imagine being on a ship in a storm for 14 days, for 2 weeks solid. I don't care who you are, what kind of sea legs you got. You're going to have some awfully sick people on that boat. Especially the idea that they can't eat a lot of food because they're trying to ration it because they weren't planning to be here. They were planning just a couple of days to reach Phoenix, not 2 weeks out at sea. They get to the 14th night. As they're looking, they realize they are nearing ground, and they begin to take soundings. And the way they would take a sounding is they'd have ropes with knots on them that told them different fathoms. Fathoms is how deep they measure the ocean. And so what you'd do is you'd take your rope that has the weight at the end of it, and you'd throw it off the side of the boat. When it hit the bottom of the seafloor, they'd pull it up, and they would mark the knots that were wet, and they would count, and they would know how deep the water was. And what they would do is they'd sound the sounding off, they'd count the knots, they'd wait a little bit, and they would do it again. They keep doing this to see how shallow the water is. And so what we realized is that they have sailed off, and they have, in these 14 days, they've traveled all the way over here. Now this says Melita, but this is the island of Malta. Melita is another word for Malta. This is the island they're heading for. This is the island they see. And so they begin to take these fathoms, and notice they start out, they find 20, then they find 15. And when they get to 15 fathoms, they realize they got to stop because they are doing this at night. And notice at midnight, they realize they see land, they see something. They begin to take these soundings. They get 15 fathoms deep, and they stop because they know that it's not going to be long until they're going to run out of the bottom of the ocean. And two, when you get near these islands, a lot of these islands have rocks hanging outside of them. And so to keep them from ramming into a rock in the middle of the night, they dropped the anchors. And notice they dropped the anchors and they prayed for day. Verse 30, as they're sitting here, the sailors decide that they're going to bail ship. The lifeboats are on the side, but we call lifeboats the smaller boats for excursions within there. The sailors go to get on those boats to get away from the Romans and say basically good luck to y'all. Paul sees this, and he tells the centurion and the soldiers, he says, hey, unless them guys stay on the ship, you cannot be saved. Unless we've got the whole crew, we're not going to make it. Then you notice they cut the ship's boats away and they let it go. Verse 33, the day begins to dawn. And as they begin to dawn, Paul gets everybody together, and he tells them before we have a shipwreck, everybody needs to eat. They've been days without food, very little food. He says, basically, eat what we got left in the ship. The ship's going to sink. So let's get a good meal so we got energy to make it to shore. And then you notice, he says there's nothing there. They take food. Now notice again, he prays for the bread, verse 35. He prays for the food. They ate it, verse 36. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So again, they throw out the wheat. They throw out the last bit of food because they know the idea is to make the ship as light as possible, to go as close to the island as they can before they shipwreck. Again, they wake up the next morning, they realize that the island's there, but they don't recognize the island. And so what they decide to do is they're going to run the ship aground. And in doing so, they got to get the ship as light as possible. Verse 40, so they cast off the anchors. Basically, they drop the anchors into the sea, and now they take the ropes that have been tying the anchors to the boat, and they cut them or untie them, and they leave the anchors because that's more weight. And they let the boat run a sail. And notice verse 41, they strike a reef, and the vessel run aground. And the bow was stuck and remained unmovable. And then they were said the stern was being broken by the sea, so they have to get off. Now notice verse 42. Verse 42, the soldiers decide what they're going to do is they're going to kill the prisoners. They're going to kill the prisoners lest any of them could swim away and escape. Now remember the reasoning for this. Paul has told them they're all going to be safe, but they don't have 100% faith in Paul that what he says is true. But they do know Caesar. You remember Caesar, the Roman law for a guard. If you let a prisoner escape, you have to suffer his consequence. So the Roman soldiers say, rather than us having to be beaten or killed, we're going to kill them. We're just going to go ahead and have a trial right here. We're just going to slaughter every prisoner on the boats. We ain't got to worry about it. And notice they began to do this, but verse 43, the centurion stops them. Now, this is interesting. It says the centurion stopped them, not because of all the prisoners, but only because of Paul. Paul has got connected to this centurion. Again, this is the interesting thing about Paul and how he connects to people. Is that Paul makes these connections, that the centurion refuses to let the other soldiers die or the prisoners die to save Paul. And so notice he tells them to stay alive. He says those who can swim, swim. The ones who can't, he says grab onto a plank or to a piece of the ship and float ashore. And so that's what they do. And notice the end of verse chapter 27. So it was that all were brought safely to land. So they get to the land and they all arrive with no problems. And all 276 are saved, just as Paul said would happen. And so you can imagine that Paul's words starting to gain more power, more effect, and more acceptance with these Roman soldiers and the centurion. All right, now we get into chapter 28. Chapter 28 is a very interesting chapter. After they come aboard or come to land in Malta, the native people see them. And when the native people see them, they see the shipwreck, they see these 276 men coming aboard. They do something that may sound unusual to us, but it shows not unusual, but it shows their compassion in that they built a fire for them. They built a fire so that they can warm them up and they can do their best to save them. It's not a careless, we're just going to let you die, we don't care about you. They start to build a fire. They get all the people on board. Again, notice they did it because it had begun to rain and was cold. And here we have verse 3, a very interesting interaction from verse 3 to 6. Paul is gathering up a bundle of sticks to throw them into the fire. And as he takes the sticks to throw them into a fire, a viper comes out. Again, what kind of viper this is, we don't know, but typically a viper is a description for what we would call a poisonous snake. And it comes out and bites him on the hand. And this is, again, sort of the interesting thing. The snake comes out because of the fire and bites Paul on the hand. And when Paul flings it off his hand, he flings it into the fire. Now, what's interesting about this is that when the natives see it, verse 4, this is where it gets interesting. They see it and they said, "Oh, looky here. The gods are punishing him. The sea couldn't kill him, so the gods sent a snake to finish the job." They view Paul, now this is what's interesting. Everybody on the ship views Paul as the most innocent man. These villagers start by viewing Paul as the most guilty man. They say the sea couldn't kill him, so the gods or justice sent a snake to kill him. He's going to die. And you can just picture this in your mind of what they do. Verse 5, he shakes the creature off into the fire and suffers no harm. Verse 6, they were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. They had seen this before. They had seen their fellow islanders get bit by the snake. They knew what was coming. They're watching, they're talking. Hey, just wait. Any minute now. Any minute now. But what happens? Nothing. Nothing happens to Paul. And you see the change of these people. After quite a bit of time with nothing happening to Paul, they change their minds and they say, he's not a criminal. He's a what? He's a God. He's a God among us because he survived the snake bite. And so here you have Paul, even at this point in his life, even non-intentionally doing miracles, or God doing miracles through Paul. And so he saves him. And so word begins to spread about Paul in verse 7. And when they see that, they realize that what's happening. Now, there's a chief of the island named Publius, who calls them into his house. He keeps them for 3 days. Now, at this time, as they're with Paul, and his father lays sick. Publius' father lays deathly sick. It's almost the idea they were just waiting for him to die. Paul hears about it, and Paul goes in, and he prays about him, puts his hands on him, and he heals him. And he knows, verse 9, when that had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases came to him and were cured. And then notice they honored us greatly. And when we were about to set sail, they put on board whatever we needed. So Paul begins to heal the father of the chief, and he begins to heal all the people of the island. Now, the assumption would be that in healing them, he also would have taught them about the church. He would have taught them the truth. Although it's not mentioned, the assumption is whenever we see miracles, there's teaching associated to prove who this man was, that the message was from God. It was something more than the common person. So what happens after 3 months? They prepare to finally sail to Rome. Again, the map from Malta to Rome is not very far. They're finally able to sail to Rome. And the islanders are so happy with Paul and the workers with him that they give them all that he needs. They give him all that they could, all that they need to make it, their supplies, as a thank you to Paul. You'll notice again, they set sail on a ship of Alexandria with the twin gods as a figurehead. This is, I forget the gods. I think it's Apollos and one of the other gods. Greek gods Castor and Pollux. They were on the ship, and so they sail from there. They go on to Rome. You can follow these verses. In about a week or so, they make it. Verse 14, they find the church near Rome. They come to Rome. The brothers come and meet them. The church at Rome comes, meets them, and takes them in. Again, the idea is that this was after Paul had written the book of Romans, that this happens. Because remember in the book of Romans, he says, I want to come to you. I want to see you and to teach you. And he said, I've heard about you, but I want to come see you. Well, now he's finally able to go see the church at Rome. And so Paul was able to go. And notice verse 16, he came to Rome. He was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. So again, he's under house arrest. After Paul gets there, he's under house arrest. 3 days later, the Jews came to him. And they began to discuss the case. And they come to him, and this is interesting because they come to him and say, he says, brothers, so I had done nothing against our people or the custom of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hand of the Romans. When they had examined me, they wished to set me at liberty because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case. But because the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. Though I had no charge brought to bring against my, though I had no charge brought to bring against my nation. For this reason, therefore, I have asked to see you and speak with you, since it is because of the hope of Israel that I am wearing this chain. And they said to him, we have received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here has reported or spoken evil about you. But we desire to hear from you what your views are, for with regard to this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against. They come to Paul, they realize what Paul's there to speak against, that he's there with the church, and they begin to talk, and they say, well, actually the Jewish elders have not sent any word to us. We don't know why you're here, other than your disagreement with the church. But we want to know about this church. Notice, we've heard it spoken about everywhere. Remember, the church mission, the world. Everywhere we're here, they're there. And you notice he says, we've heard nothing but it being spoken against. Well, the Jews would have been again against church. They didn't want the church. They viewed it as an offspring, as offshoot. They viewed it as a heretics and away from God. And so they began to talk about Paul, and they began to ask Paul to speak to them about what they were about what his belief was. Now again, here you see again, Paul says, I have nothing against me. There's no charge. He's basically saying there's no reason I'm here, but the Jews wouldn't let it go any other way. And the Jews, again, somewhat agree with him. Verse 23, he sets a day that they come to the house, and they come to, a great many come to his house, and they meet with him. They meet all morning, and notice he meets with them from morning to night to talk about Jesus and his church. Notice he expounded to them, testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. Again, this is another interesting thing about the first century church. All they had was the Old Testament. And so this is where he's trying to prove the church. And then you notice some believed and others disbelieved. And then you notice disagreeing among themselves, they departed after Paul had made one statement. When he says the Holy Spirit was right in saying to your fathers through Isaiah the prophet, go to this people and say, you will indeed hear but never understand. You will indeed see but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear. Their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their ears and see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Therefore, let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles. They will listen. Again, notice the phrase that cuts the Jews off. The Gentiles will listen. The Gentiles will be saved. And the Jews reject him. Then we get to the very last verse here in Acts, where we end this part of Paul's story, where he lived there 2 whole years at his own expense. and welcomed all who came to him, proclaiming the kingdom and preaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. So Paul stays there for 2 years in Rome, and he continues to preach under house arrest. And he continues to teach the same two things he taught the Gentiles, the same things Peter began preaching on the day of Pentecost: the kingdom of God, the church, and about the Lord Jesus Christ, about who he was and what he was after. And that's where we end the book of Acts. Now, there's an interesting thing about the book of Acts in the idea of the history of Paul. Because we typically, and I say this because I did this for years till I went and studied it myself, we typically think that the end of Acts is the end of Paul's story, that Paul's in a Roman law governor, he's imprisoned in Romans, therefore he's probably put to death and he dies. That's not, Luke doesn't tell us any of that. What we actually find out is that from piecing other books of the Bible together, that Luke leaves Paul in prison, but that's not where Paul dies. If we look at the books specifically of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, we can see what happens to Paul after Acts. Now, Eusebius is an early church historian who wrote in 275 to 339 AD. He's not inspired. He's not a Bible writer, but he is an ancient historian. He wrote a lot about the history of the church. And in writing about the history of the church, he tells us that Paul defended himself this time, but that he is later returned to Rome during Nero's reign when he's martyred. So it's not at this time that Paul is put to death, but it is during the death of Nero. And so what we see is that actually the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus back up what Eusebius says, or Eusebius' claim backs up 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. When we look at those books, we can see a difference. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about how we know there's more to the life of Paul after the book of Acts. One reason is that there's a difference in the prison epistles and 2nd Timothy. The prison epistles, if you remember what we call prison epistles, this is Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. These are the books that Paul writes when he's on the way from in Caesarea and on the way to Rome and even at Rome, when he's under that first imprisonment. And what's interesting is those prison epistles are basically cheerful. Even though Paul is under arrest, even though Paul is in prison, there's hope, there's assurance. You know, we talk about Philippians. We describe Philippians in one word. What is it? Joy. There's a cheerful manner to his prison epistles. It's almost a cheerful opinion that he's going to get out, that it's just temporary. However, when you read the book of 2 Timothy, he will talk about being in prison. But the book of 2 Timothy is not a cheerful book, not a hopeful book of expectation being free. It is a more somber and more true ending of the story, that he knows his life is over. That's where he says, I'm being poured out like a drink offering. The time of my departure is at hand. I've run the race. I've finished the course. And so that's one of the differences between 2 Timothy and these prison epistles. There's also the idea of some other things that are different between these two. In the prison epistles, Paul is surrounded by all of his friends. The prison epistles are some of those we look at to figure out who the we are. Paul talks about all these people who are with him, but yet in 2 Timothy, again, he talks about being in prison, and he says, I'm abandoned by all except Luke. Again, leading to the idea that the prison epistles and Timothy talk about two different imprisonments. Also, the again, like I said a minute ago, in the prison epistles, he expects to be released. However, in 2 Timothy, he is expecting death. He expects that his death is coming, death is waiting. And therefore, these lend credence to the idea that there's two imprisonments. Luke talks about the first one, and then there's one later, about 5 years after the end of Acts. We said Acts is probably written about 62, 63 AD. Nero comes to power in 67, and Nero's the one who puts Paul to death. So there's more time here. Again, we talked about this way back in the first class. You would think if Paul was put to death at the end of Acts, Luke would have told us. But Paul, when Luke wrote this letter, he would have summed up and said, this happened to Paul, but he doesn't tell us that. And that's because it's not until 5 years later that Paul meets his end. Now, some other things that are interesting. You may say, okay, well, but that doesn't convince me. Well, let's talk about some things. There are unexplained actions in Timothy and Titus that are not found in the book of Acts. And again, some of these you may say, well, Luke just didn't tell us everything. Yeah, but there are some things that don't really make sense. What happens here first is 1 Timothy 1:2. Timothy is sent to Ephesus to counteract the influence of certain false teachers. Now, here's what's interesting, is Paul is mentioned as staying in Macedonia. Nowhere in the book of Acts do we read of Paul being in Macedonia and sending Timothy to Ephesus. And so this has led some Bible scholars to say, well, this happens after Acts. That Paul got out of Rome and he went back. And he went back on his missionary trips. He would have went into Europe. Some think he went to Europe, maybe went as far as Spain. Because he was in Rome, and Rome's a whole lot closer to Spain than Israel is. So he may have went that way. Another thing that happens, he talks about leaving Titus in Crete to set things in order that were wanted. The book of Acts never mentions Paul sending Titus to Crete. So when did this happen? There's a mention of his visit to Miletus when he leaves Trophimus there sick. He leaves Trophimus in Miletus, who's sick, as Paul continues his trip. The book of Acts doesn't talk about this. There's also Titus 3:12, talks about Paul mentions being in Nicopolis to spend the winter. We don't have that in the book of Acts. And what happens is these events, you may say, well, Paul didn't include these. These events are hard to fit into the Acts timeline. And if they didn't fit in the Acts timeline, that leads credence to the idea that they happened after Acts, that Paul was able to be free. And so what happens is what most people think is that the book of Acts is done, is completed. Luke begins to circulate it. After Paul is released, after 2 to 3 years, we don't know exactly how long, he goes back on missionary trips. And Paul writes Titus and Timothy as a free citizen. He doesn't talk about being in prison. He doesn't talk about being in Rome. He doesn't mention any of those facts. He's out, again, seems to be out doing his mission work. In 2 Timothy, he's back in prison. And what most historians and Bible scholars think happened is that Nero comes to power. And Nero comes to power about AD 67. Nero was the emperor who had the greatest Christian persecution ever. He was the one who put Christians on fire in his garden to light it. He accused the Christians of burning down Rome. He was the one who threw them into the gladiator games. And so most historians think that Nero would have wanted a well-known Christian to be martyred and killed or persecuted. So what they think happens is when Paul's out and in one of his trips, Nero sends soldiers after Paul. Either that or Paul's arrested by the Jews and the Rome finds out about it. And Rome pulls Paul back to, the Roman government pulls Paul back to Rome. And it's during this time at Rome is when he writes 2 Timothy. And Paul knows his end's at hand, and that's why he tells Timothy, come as quickly as you can. Come quickly. And then if this is true, and again, we're putting facts together. Again, we can't 100% say this would happen. If this happens in AD 67, then that placed his final arrest and his execution about 5 years after the end of Acts. That is after the end of Acts, that's been closed, the book's been closed, and Luke's finishes writing, and Acts is beginning to circulate around the churches that Paul has finally put to death. And that's more the timeline. And that seems to be the truth of what happens at the end of Acts. Now, again, what's interesting about this, and I'll say this from personal experience, is I always assumed for years that Paul must die at the end of Acts because it doesn't talk about anything. But looking at the other books, we have this idea that he was still going. And so that tells us that Acts was written to tell us about Paul, to record his end and record what he had done. And it served the purpose to reveal, way back in chapter 1, to reveal to Theophilus all the things that Jesus began to do and to teach. That all the things he began and he started, in the gospel. They are brought to the end in the book of Acts, and therefore these men carried out that mission. And Jesus is proven to be the Son of God, and we're told about how his church, the kingdom of God, came about. And notice from beginning to end of the book of Acts, there is a teaching and preaching about how the church grew and developed. And no matter how bad or how desperate situations got in Jerusalem or other places, the church continued to grow, it continued to thrive, and it continued to do great things. And so this is the history of Acts. This is the beginning of the church. How the church began, it was tried to stop many times, but yet it failed over and over again. And again, one of the things I think is not by coincidence that Luke mentions in Acts 5 is that statement by Gamaliel when he tells the other people that he tells the other council members, remember, that if this is a movement made by man, it will die over time. But if this is from God, there's nothing we can do to stop it. And his words prove true as the book of Acts came to a close with the church not just being in Jerusalem, but it has spread to that entire world. And again, this is one of the things about Acts that I wish we had more of, because we just read about Paul. Imagine if we could hear what all Peter did, what all John did, James did, Bartholomew, Andrew, all those 12 apostles. If we could have heard their story, imagine how great it would be to know what they did. But those stories are not recorded for us. What we do have is the story of Paul and of Peter and the early church to show how these men took the church from its humble beginnings, because it was the Word of God, and God had it grow and develop so that we can learn how to be that same church today. All right, any question or comment about the book of Acts?
Just one quick one. It's
Okay.
there with Luke that on the shipwreck being with Sam because of the us.
Yeah, us.
Was he also under arrest, or was he just a traveling companion?
He was just one of the traveling companions. And we know that from, I think it's 27. It talks about the centurion let him have his friends who could take care of him. So we assume Luke was one of those. Of what we know, Paul was the only one who was officially under arrest. And we would assume that too because Luke would have to be a traveling companion, because we don't know of Luke being a Roman citizen. The only traveler with Paul we know that was Roman was Silas, and he's not mentioned here. So I say that to say Luke couldn't appeal to Caesar, whereas Paul could, and so that's why Paul seems to be the one they focused on. And they do that throughout the book. If you remember, when Paul was on the trips and the Jews fought him, Paul would have to leave, but Silas and Timothy could stay, and the Jews didn't cause problems for them. It was just Paul. And so that seems to be the idea that Paul was the one that was only one under arrest, but the others could travel with him. And again, the we seems to point to the idea there's more than just Luke with him. That Paul probably had a pretty good group that was with him and trying to see what was going to happen. Any other question or comment? All right. If not, let me stop this video and we'll talk about what we got left.